Welcome to Coming to New England. My name is Erik DonFrancesco, and my guest today is my father, Robert DonFrancesco. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for asking me to come.
So to start off, just introduce yourself with your full name.
Yeah, my name is Robert Anthony DonFrancesco.
And when and where were you born?
I was born in 1958 in Providence, Rhode Island.
And what is your ethnic background?
Well, interestingly enough, it's half Italian and half French-Canadian.
And do you know how your family ended up in the United States?
I do.
And how did they do that?
Okay, well, first there is my paternal grandfather. His name was Antonio DonFrancesco, and he was from a small mountainside village about 50 miles from south of Rome, Italy. And he came over here in the early 1900s. He came over because his brother was here, and his brother was a stonemason, and his brother invited him to come to the U.S. And my paternal grandmother, her name was Maria Grace DonFrancesco, Bianco actually, and she came over around the same time. She came over to be with her cousins who were on Federal Hill in Providence. And on my mom's side, her dad was actually a doctor in Canada, Montreal, Canada. He came and had a very successful practice in Worcester. He actually had 2 offices. And my maternal grandmother, she was also from Canada and came here around the same time, and they settled in Worcester, Massachusetts.
And on your father's side, they went through Ellis Island, correct?
They did, yeah.
And what do you know of?
I don't know much, Eric, about how they got through Ellis Island. We did visit Ellis Island way back when, and we did find his name in the register. I do know that one of the things that my grandfather was proud of was that as he came through Ellis Island, as many of the immigrants came through Ellis Island, if the person processing you couldn't spell your name, they would shorten the last name. And DonFrancesco is kind of a lengthy name, and my grandfather was always proud that his name wasn't shortened in the process.
Do you know how your parents met?
I do. My dad, first of all, was in World War II. He was on an aircraft carrier in the Navy for 4 years, and he actually enlisted in the Navy because he did not want to get drafted into the Army. So he did not go to college. He actually went through 4 years in the Navy, and then he met my mom at dances that they used to hold on a weekly basis in a big dance hall, and actually it was in Cranston. Yeah.
What was your home life like growing up?
Well, I was one of, my mom actually had 9 children, and but two passed away. But so that made us one of 7, made me one of 7 in the household, and there always was a lot going on as a family member amongst my siblings. But I'd say that overall we had a really good upbringing and good life together. I think that one of the things that was kind of unique for our family is that we had such a large family, and we'd get comments sometimes from friends about us being part of an army, or that, you know, how come your parents had so many children and what's it like growing up in a large family? And my answer would always be, we knew no different. We only knew what it was like to grow up in a large family. So if we met someone that was only a single child in a family, they grew up in a family that was just one, and that's kind of the way that they were raised. So we knew no different. But I'd say on some occasions we'd have some of our friends kidding us about the size of our family, it being a small army. So that's one thing that kind of resonates with me.
What did you admire most about your parents?
I'd say that there were a couple of things, and one of them is, I mentioned to you that I was one of 9, and my mom lost one baby 1 week after birth. But I think the more tragic one was that when she was pregnant with me, she had my brother James, who was 5 years old at the time, he was crossing the street in front of our house, and he was hit and killed by a drunk driver. And I wasn't born at the time. She was pregnant with me, and I'd say that I always admired the strength that my mom and dad had getting through such a tragic event. I just don't know how I would have been able to handle that. So that's one of the things that I always admired, that they were able to move on. Always had the memory of my brother James in the house. Never really talked about it, but the strength in getting through that tragic time as a couple was always something that I was always amazed at. And as I grow older, and as I had children, especially around the age of 5, it was always fearful to me that something might happen to my 5-year-old, so it was always vivid in my mind. So I'd say that them getting through such a tough time would be one thing. The other thing is my dad was a hard worker. He never made a lot of money, but we never went without. He was not cheap, but he was frugal. And he just instilled a way of us having a good work ethic and also saving. And those are things that I've always admired in my mom and dad.
How much of a role did religion play in your home growing up?
Well, I was raised Roman Catholic. We'd go to Mass every single Sunday, but I also went to Catholic schools until I was in 8th grade, and then in 9th grade I went to public school. I would say that religion was a little bit different, or Roman Catholicism was a little bit different then than it is now. It seems like it has a more of a negative connotation in today's society than it did before. A lot of times religion and events around religious events was something that we celebrated. So I'd say that it definitely created or was woven into the fabric of my life.
Are there any special family items that have been passed down from generation to generation?
I'd say it would be more of traditional things, and I'd say around meals, things around, let's say, Christmas time. We would have a lot of fishes on Christmas Eve, and one of the traditions that I try to still maintain to this day is Sunday dinners. That it has always been important to me, and we always got together as a family at every meal, every day, but Sunday meals were extra special, and a lot of times we'd have visitors coming over. So as you know, I like to keep the tradition going of getting the family together at least once a week, and Sunday seems to be that day.
Were there ever any stories that your father used to tell about your grandfather to you?
Oh yeah, he'd always talk about how Grandpa would be very, very good at winemaking, and that was a tradition that also I did with my dad, is making wine, and that was a pretty interesting thing. Also, my grandfather always continued the tradition of meals together, and so that's one of the things that I feel like has been passed on to me as well.
Are there any family anecdotes, just at all, like your dad in the war or anything like that?
Yeah, I'll tell you one story that my dad never really talked about his service, but he did have a conversation with me that I still remember to this day. I was waiting to pick up one of my siblings with my father in the car. It was a rainy day, and I was probably 13 or 14 years old, and all of a sudden he told me a story about how he was on an aircraft carrier, and they were in the Pacific Ocean, and they were getting bombed by kamikazes from Japan. And you might know that the kamikazes would actually crash their planes onto the aircraft carriers in order to create an explosion. They'd also fly down the smokestacks of the chimneys of the aircraft carriers to try to create big explosions and blow it up because they weren't as successful in bombing. And my dad was actually, his responsibility was to be in the engine room of the aircraft carrier, and the engine room was several, I'd say, stories below the water and the water line, and all he could hear was explosions happening around him. And he said it was the most he'd ever been scared in his life, and all he wished for was that if the boat was going to sink, that he'd be on the deck, because it's very possible, back then they didn't have the communications that they have today, that the boat could be sinking and be on its way to the bottom, and he would never know it because he was so far below the decks. And he said to me it was the most scared he ever was in his life. And he said, for all of those people out there that are atheists that I was around, he said, all of a sudden, he said, they were all praying. So he said that in war and in combat, it's amazing how many atheists start praying. And that kind of stuck with me.
Are there any things that you want your children to pass on to their families?
I would just say a good work ethic, and also it's really difficult sometimes, but to be as honest and true to yourself as you possibly can. And the most important thing is to stay close to your family. I think family is important. When all else fails you, you can always rely on your family. No matter what is going on, try to keep your family together. I want them to remember and honor their Italian tradition, that my grandparents fought hard to make it to this country. And I want all of my children to appreciate the fact that they made sacrifices at a very young age. They were only in their early 20s, leaving the country behind and coming and seeking out a new world. So I think that one of the things that I want my children to know and their children to know is that there were big sacrifices that were made back then for us to have the life that we have today.
How would you define the American dream?
Well, I think that the American dream is defined differently for everyone. So for me, I'd say the first thing that pops into my mind is having a loving family and family around me for the rest of my life. I'd say also part of the American dream is not necessarily material things, although material things can make us comfortable. So I think that the ability to have the freedom to pursue our dreams is really what the American dream is all about, and really why my grandparents came here is they wanted to have the freedom to live the life that they wanted to. So the American dream to them was truly more freedom and more opportunity than they had in their own countries.
It has been my pleasure to interview you today. I'm Erik DonFrancesco, and you've been watching Coming to New England.
Thank you for having me.